The base rules of D&D 5e want your player characters to feel like epic heroes, able to brave dangers and bounce back from injuries like no ordinary person could. This may be because of special or uncanny skills, access to magic, or divine favor. But because of this, it's difficult to evoke a dark fantasy atmosphere in your 5e campaign. The heroes of dark fantasy tales must often sacrifice physically, mentally, or morally to find some form of success. My name is Byrne, and this is Wounds and Recovery in your Dark Fantasy D&D campaign. The rules we'll be looking at often penalize the player characters in some way, which doesn't immediately suggest fun for the entire table. However, the aim isn't to punish the player characters or give the GM more ways to beat them into submission. The intention is to change how the entire table, including the GM, engages with the game systems to tell a story where the player characters feel much more vulnerable to the dangers of the world that they inhabit. Because the more vulnerable the characters are, the higher the stakes and sense of drama becomes in the story that you're all telling together. Currently, there is almost no way to mechanically heighten the drama in 5e beyond the current adventuring day, because most of the time the party returns to full strength by the dawn of each morning.
Let's take a long rest.
This means that there's often no real risk in fighting unless this specific enemy encounter poses a considerable threat to the party purely by itself. And if the consequences of a fight are simply wiped away each night during a long rest, the fight didn't develop the story as much as it could have, which is why random encounters often feel superfluous. If a combat isn't actually developing or changing the story in some way, then it's really just padding out the game time. A protracted long rest and short rest cycle forces the player characters to manage their resources more carefully across a number of adventuring days. The danger rises with each day spent in the wilderness or spent inside a dungeon. Grievous and permanent wounds can also add to this narrative tension, but also help tell the story of your player characters across the breadth of your entire campaign. Dark fantasy heroes probably should be at least a little scarred by their experiences during the story, and Grievous wounds help to make that feel truly part of the narrative through the mechanics. The 5e Dungeon Master's Guide and the Grim Hollow Campaign Guide both give suggestions for alternative resting rules for a grittier campaign experience. The DMG suggests changing short rests to take 8 hours rather than 1 hour, while a long rest instead takes 7 days. 7 days seems a bit too long of a time jump when there may be time pressures in the story of your campaign. The Grim Hollow Campaign Guide adds the quick rest, which only takes 1 hour but only allows characters to roll hit dice to regain health, and that's about it. They're just catching their breath and patching themselves up. A short rest is 8 hours long, usually sleeping at the end of an adventurer's day, and the long rest is 72 hours, but importantly can only be accomplished in a place of shelter and relative safety. Travel between settlements actually becomes dangerous because the party can't long rest in the wilderness and therefore aren't at full strength every day of the journey. It's hard to feel like travel isn't just best hand-waved and time skipped in 5e, because unless you're slowing the pace of your campaign right down with multiple encounters each day, combat on the road feels trivial because the party is frequently long resting. But when long rests need to happen in a place of relative safety, you can have encounters on the 3rd and 4th day of that 7-day journey, and each encounter feels progressively more dangerous. The journey feels more harrowing. Of course, not every encounter on that journey even needs to be an inevitable combat. Maybe your party manages to sneak around the 3 arguing trolls or bargain with them instead. The decision about whether to fight becomes more important when the party everybody knows they won't get their expended resources back until the very end of the journey. Having played with the Grim Hollow rest rules for a little while now, there are some further tweaks that I can suggest that may make them more palatable to your group. Firstly, I reduced the length of a long rest down to roughly 36 hours. One full day of downtime between 2 nights of restful sleep in a safe area. This day in between can also be used for light downtime activities such as shopping for new equipment, learning new skills, or the PCs developing their characters and relationships by chatting with each other. The other changes that I make is that hit dice are all recovered on a long rest instead of just half of them. In the Grim Hollow system, both a quick rest and a short rest use hit dice, and so they get used up pretty quickly across multiple adventuring days. Only getting half back meant that the characters were really struggling to ever have more than a small handful of hit dice available, even at the start of the next leg of their adventure after a long rest. There's also plenty of other benefits to these resting rules for capturing an atmosphere of a dark fantasy adventure as well. I spoke in one of our fantastic videos on magic in a dark fantasy D&D game about how these alternative rest rules make spellcasting feel like an event when it happens. Fireballs and divine smites become less common in every fight your party contends with because those spell slots become so much more precious. But when those spells are cast, the magic feels more powerful, more wondrous, more dangerous. Obviously, combat encounters themselves do need to become either less frequent or less deadly per day to accommodate the characters having to stretch their resources more thinly. The aim isn't to punish the players by depleting their resources and then continuing to drop deadly encounters on them even when they can't get somewhere safe to rest. It means that you may need to rethink how you balance encounters to ensure they still have a sense of danger to them but aren't needlessly stacked against the party. The aim is to make the campaign world feel grittier and combat riskier by making powerful character abilities less readily available and making recovery take longer. Grievous wounds and permanent wounds leave a mark on your character that help tell the story of their adventures. Grievous and permanent wounds, once more, aren't intended to punish the player characters. They are a storytelling mechanic to make your fantasy world feel more dangerous and to illustrate what has been sacrificed by your heroes for their victories. Outlined in the Grim Hollow campaign guide, grievous wounds are inflicted when a character drops to 0 hit points. You roll on a chart that gives penalties such as having your speed halved due to a sprained ankle, or deep lacerations making it impossible for you to regain hit points. These penalties can be stacked if your character drops to 0 multiple times, but all are healed if you or another character succeed a DC 10 medicine check at the end of a long rest. In my home game, I've also added that someone proficient with medicine can automatically cure grievous wounds by making use of a healer's kit during a long rest. This can help emphasize the importance of knowledgeable doctors in your world rather than just miraculous healers. Grievous wounds add an incentive for characters to not drop to 0 hit points, requiring frontline fighters to fight more cautiously and healers to heal more proactively. Ideally, it encourages the entire party to choose their battles more carefully whenever possible. I like the suite of grievous wounds that are in the campaign guide, also like some of the other ones in the Dungeon Master's guide, which are named lingering injuries on page 272. It's simple to adapt them across or use them to increase the number of possible grievous wounds that could be suffered. Dale Kingsmill has also created an excellent set of grievous wounds she calls major injuries, which are specified to the damage type taken. I'll throw a link to the most recent version of her major injuries table up there, but you can also find her video about it by searching Dale Kingsmill injuries on YouTube. Sounds kind of mean when I say it like that. You can even occasionally supplement a grievous wound for a short-term or long-term madness from the Dungeon Master's Guide to represent the psychological trauma suffered by a character when coming so close to death. The point is to try to expand your list of grievous wounds as much as possible so the same wounds don't keep coming up and repeating themselves. It also helps that the wounds suffered feel unique to each character that bears them. As Dale said when I was talking about this with her, it only feels cool to have a missing eye if not everyone in the party has a missing eye. Which, as a side note, I actually thought was a cool idea for a party where everybody's got a missing eye and their sigil is an eye and there's like some... Anyway, next bit. When Grievous wounds happen too frequently, it can blunt their effectiveness as a storytelling tool, and the characters or the players can start to feel a little bit over-penalized. You might decide instead that a Grievous wound is only suffered if a character takes over half of their hit points in damage in a single attack, which is the Dale Kingsmill method. Or when they receive a critical hit, which is what's described in the DMG. The characters might suffer a Grievous wound only if they drop to 0 hit points and they fail one death saving throw. Find whatever works for your table. If Grievous wounds start to stack too highly during a session, sometimes I substitute the wounds for a level of exhaustion instead. And I have been using the 1 DnD method of exhaustion, which simply subtracts 1 from all rolls being made for each level of exhaustion. I believe in a 1 DnD play test, a creature dies when they reach 10 levels of exhaustion, if I'm remembering correctly, instead of the 5e version, which only has 5 or 6 levels of exhaustion. I've also found that 5e exhaustion gets pretty punishing pretty quickly, causing players to disengage from the game entirely once they're rolling ability checks at disadvantage. I've found that the -1 or -2 penalty is a penalty, but it doesn't make the ability check not worth rolling in the first place, especially when it's a skill that the character already has expertise in. So, thumbs up 1 DnD on that account, I guess. If you found the video useful, make sure to give it a like. You can join the party by subscribing to the channel because we're back almost every week with more tips and advice for making your 5e campaign like a dark fantasy. You can also check out this video about making magic feel rare and dangerous in your 5e campaign, or check out this video for an introduction to Grim Hollow's most feared institution, the Arcanist Inquisition.